I knew the night was going wrong the moment I looked at the security feed and saw a man standing on the far end of the oil rig platform, even though I was supposed to be the only one topside after midnight. People think the danger out here comes from storms or machinery, but it's the 11 rules they never tell new watchmen that keep you alive, and breaking even one of them feels like inviting something in. I still remember the first time I ignored one, convincing myself it was harmless, right up until the moment the lights went out and I heard someone breathing behind me. I still don't know how it got that close without footsteps. I learned about Rule 1, never step into the corridor after midnight, unless the emergency beacon is flashing on my first week as the night watchman, though no one ever bothered to explain why it mattered so much. The corridor runs along the outer spine of the rig, a narrow metal artery leading from the watch post to the generator wing, and during the day it feels ordinary enough. But something about the air changes after midnight, turning the passage into a place I never wanted to be caught alone. I didn't believe the older crew when they warned me about it, mostly because they spoke in circles instead of answers. Still, I kept the rule in mind, even when I thought it was nothing more than an overblown superstition. That first night shift was quiet, the kind of silence that starts to feel heavy after a while, pressing against your ribs until you forget how big the ocean is around you. I stayed in the watch post, checking the monitors and listening to the distant hum of the generators. Every now and then the metal walls groaned as if the rig were settling into itself, but I had learned not to pay attention to those sounds. The corridor camera showed nothing unusual, just dim lights and a stretch of empty walkway leading into the dark. I remember thinking the rule was unnecessary, a leftover warning from the old-timers who liked to scare newcomers. It was around 12:40 when something shifted on the feed, too faint at first for me to be sure I'd seen anything. The lights flickered, just once, and a blurry shape drifted at the far end of the corridor. I leaned closer, trying to figure out if it was a person, or just a shadow from the swaying rig. Rain hammered the metal outside, muted through the thick walls, and the screens reflected faint distortions that made it impossible to tell what was real. I wiped my face with both hands and tried to blink away the exhaustion creeping into my bones. The shape was gone when I looked again, leaving the corridor empty and still. I wanted to shake off the feeling settling at the base of my spine, but the discomfort lingered like a slow tightening band around my chest. I checked the emergency beacon indicator, more out of curiosity than concern, and felt a weird relief when the panel showed nothing unusual. The rule only applied when the beacon flashed, and everything was normal. I told myself this was part of adjusting to night watch, the hallucinations that come from staring at dim, glitching screens and listening to too much silence. I sighed, drank water that had warmed in the cup, and tried to convince myself I wasn't rattled. The sound that followed didn't match anything the rig normally produced. It wasn't the low mechanical hum of the engines, or the wind moaning through the support beams. It was softer and slower, like someone dragging their fingertips across the outer wall of the corridor, tracing a path from one end to the other. I froze with my hand halfway to the radio, afraid that acknowledging the noise would make it more real. Each stroke crawled along the metal, patient and deliberate, as if the source knew I was listening. I checked the feed again, hoping for a glitch or a malfunction, but the cameras showed nothing except the same corridor bathed in pale security lights. My chest tightened when I remembered how close the wall of that hallway was to my watch post, barely 10 meters across the platform, separated only by a maze of steel beams and weather-beaten pipes. I could almost picture someone running their fingers along the metal, moving slowly toward the corner where the corridor turned out of sight. Even though I knew better, I kept imagining footsteps following that same path. The sound stopped all at once, leaving behind a silence sharper than before. My ears strained for anything that might explain it, but the room held its breath. I told myself to focus on the monitors, to stay alert, and to ignore my imagination. But when the lights on the generator panel flickered again, my heart lurched into my throat. I thought about calling the control room, though I already knew what they would say. Power anomalies happen all the time on rigs like ours. Weather, salt, moisture, corrosion, a dozen harmless explanations. The corridor camera jumped with static, cutting out for a full second before returning with a slightly different angle. That wasn't possible. The cameras were bolted into place and monitored for glitches. I leaned closer, eyes narrowing at the image. The hallway looked the same at first glance, but I spotted something off in the shadows near the far end, something shaped just different enough to make my breath catch. It reminded me of a shoulder or the outline of a head tilted against the rail. And then the monitor flickered, and whatever it was vanished again. I stood up, legs stiff from sitting too long, and stepped toward the workstation window that overlooked the platform. The storm outside had thickened, turning the world into a smear of rain and wind. The lights from the corridor's outer wall reflected faintly across the wet steel, shimmering with each gust. I tried to shake off the sense that someone was out there, just out of sight, moving toward the watch post with a patience that chilled me. It made no sense, but the thought grew stronger with every passing second. When the corridor feed glitched again, it didn't flicker back to normal. Instead, the camera froze on a frame so dark I had to squint to make out the shapes. The hallway, the railing, the emergency phone, and something else, just barely visible near the bottom of the screen, like a pair of hands gripping the edge of the floor. The fingers looked too long, too still, and too pale to belong to anyone I worked with. My arms broke into goosebumps as I realized the camera wasn't malfunctioning. It was catching something I wasn't meant to see. The hand slipped out of sight as the camera stuttered back to life, leaving the corridor empty once more. I backed away from the screen without meaning to, shivering despite the warm air humming from the overhead vents. I knew better than to leave the watch post, especially after everything I'd just seen. But when the lights overhead dimmed a second time, I instinctively grabbed my flashlight and moved toward the door. The corridor remained untouched on the screen, looking harmless and clean under the steady glow. My hand hovered over the door controls, torn between duty and fear, trying to decide whether this counted as an emergency. The beacon wasn't flashing, and I wasn't supposed to step into the corridor without it. Still, the unease crawling up my spine whispered that something was waiting for me, something that understood the rules better than I did. My fingers brushed the release switch, hesitating one last time as the quiet settled into a suffocating weight around me. Then from somewhere beyond the door, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone breathing, waiting. The moment I learned about Rule 2, keep the watch post door locked until sunrise, no matter who asks you to open it, I thought it was a joke, some exaggerated warning meant to haze new watchmen. But standing there with my hand above the release switch, hearing that slow, steady breathing on the other side of the metal door, I understood exactly why the older crew spoke about this rule with a kind of quiet dread. The breath didn't sound like anyone I knew. It was too patient, too controlled, as if whoever was standing outside had been waiting for me to break protocol. The radio sat silent on the desk behind me, offering no reassurance, and the monitors seemed to darken as the tension thickened around the room. I stepped back from the door slowly, not wanting to make any noise that might signal I was paying attention. The breathing didn't follow or grow louder, but it didn't fade either. It remained steady in the hallway, persistent and unsettling, as though the source had no reason to move. The overhead lights flickered once more, dimming just long enough for the shadows in the corners of the room to stretch in unnatural shapes. My chest tightened at the thought of someone leaning right outside the door, head tilted toward the metal, listening for any sign I was approaching again. Every instinct in me screamed to check the corridor feed, but the monitor showed the hallway empty, bathed in sterile white light, without a single figure in sight. I kept glancing between the door and the screen, trying to make sense of the contradiction. The hall camera should have picked up anything standing there, especially something breathing loud enough for me to hear it through thick steel. My first thought was a blind spot, some tiny corner the camera didn't catch, but I knew that wasn't accurate. The system was designed specifically to avoid blind angles in case of accidents or intruders. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach as I noticed something else. The timestamp on the feed kept skipping seconds in irregular intervals, not fast enough for most people to notice, but obvious when you're alone during a night shift, counting the passing moments because there's nothing else to do. I backed away from the door until my legs brushed the edge of the workstation chair, grounding myself with the familiar feel of metal against my knees. My breathing felt shallow, and for a moment I worried the thing outside would hear it. I forced myself to take slow, quiet breaths, trying to remain unnoticed. The storm outside rattled the steel frame of the watch post, and water streaked down the small window above the equipment panel in twisting patterns. I wished someone else were on duty with me, even the old mechanic who never spoke more than a few clipped words. Anyone would have been better than facing the growing dread alone. But night shifts after midnight are always solitary, another unspoken rule that no one wrote down. The breathing outside the door stopped abruptly, leaving behind a whole new kind of silence, one that felt heavier, denser, as if the air itself were waiting. I didn't trust it, not even for a second. I stayed still for a long moment, afraid even to turn my head. When nothing else happened, I slowly reached for the radio to call the control room, unsure if I even wanted them involved. My fingers had barely brushed the button when a soft vibration shuddered through the floor. It was faint but unmistakable, like someone dragging something heavy down the corridor. The door pulsed with a quiet metallic thump that I felt more than heard. Not a knock, not a strike, just weight brushing against the other side. I swallowed hard and checked the camera again, convinced I would finally see whatever was outside. But the hallway remained unchanged, empty from end to end. The lights buzzed faintly, washing the corridor in pale brightness. Nothing moved. No shadow, no figure, no disturbance. If anyone had pressed their weight against the door, the camera would have captured it. My skin prickled as I realized the truth I didn't want to accept. Whatever was out there wasn't showing up on the feed. Either the system was failing in a very specific way, or something else was happening. Something beyond malfunction or human presence. The vibration across the floor stopped suddenly, replaced by the subtle groan of the metal beams outside as the storm intensified. The rain pounded the rig harder, and wind howled through the support structures. I wanted to convince myself that the noises were nothing more than the weather, but the earlier breathing made that impossible. I sat down at the workstation, trying to force myself to focus on the monitors and ignore the instinct telling me to stay far away from the door. With each passing minute, the sense of being watched crept deeper into my mind, even though every screen insisted I was alone. A flicker on the generator monitor snapped my attention to the lower left display. The voltage dipped and rose in uneven pulses, a sign of instability we were trained to track closely. But the pattern didn't match the usual fluctuations caused by moisture or wiring issues. It felt deliberate, rising and falling in a rhythm far too slow to be natural. I leaned forward, scanning the readings and noting the strange intervals, trying to determine whether I should alert someone or wait for it to stabilize. A slight hum rose beneath my feet, vibrating up through the chair and into my spine. I stared at the monitors, trying to understand if something in the generator wing was malfunctioning, or if something was near it. The corridor camera glitched again, the picture warping for a full 2 seconds before clearing. For a split moment during the distortion, I saw a shape tall, thin, and slightly slouched, standing near the generator wing door at the far end of the hallway. The shape held still, too still, and then the distortion blurred it out of sight. When the feed returned to normal, the hallway was empty again. My breath caught in my throat as I rewound the footage, but the system wouldn't let me review anything. The controls froze, denying access to playback entirely, as though the rig itself didn't want me to see what I had just glimpsed. A faint scrape echoed from the ceiling above me, something sliding across the metal plates. Dust drifted down in a thin line above the center of the room, and I stared at it with a growing sense of dread. The watch post had no accessible crawl space. No one should be up there. The noise moved slowly, almost curiously, as if whatever was above me were exploring the structure, searching for a way in. I backed toward the corner near the supply cabinet, keeping my eyes on the ceiling and the monitors at the same time, unsure which direction posed the greater danger. Then all at once, the radio on the desk crackled to life with a burst of static, so sharp it made me flinch. A voice followed, thin, distant, and distorted, as though speaking from underwater. At first I couldn't make out any words, only the shape of speech behind the noise. But the tone shifted suddenly, aligning into a single phrase that slid through the static with alarming clarity. "Open the door." My stomach dropped, and every hair on my arms stood on end. I didn't recognize the voice, but it sounded like someone trying very hard to mimic a human tone, as if learning the cadence rather than understanding the meaning. The radio fell silent again, leaving behind a high ringing in my ears. I stood frozen, staring at the device as if expecting it to speak again. Part of me wanted to unplug it, to shut it off and eliminate the possibility of hearing that voice once more. But another part of me knew that cutting communication might be even more dangerous. I didn't dare move from my corner until several minutes passed without any more interference. The silence felt wrong, like something holding its breath outside, waiting for me to make a mistake. I turned slowly, inching my way toward the main console to check the monitors again. The corridor remained empty, lights steady, environment unchanged. But the storm outside had reached a violent peak, rattling the rig hard enough to make the walls tremble. Water sprayed against the window in relentless bursts, turning the world outside into a shifting blur. I pressed my hand against the console to steady myself as the rig groaned from the pressure of the wind. The vibration in the floor returned briefly, then faded again, leaving behind a strange ringing in the air. When I finally sat back down, I realized I was breathing faster than I intended. My hands felt numb cold despite the warm air. I wanted to radio someone, anyone, but the memory of that voice made my hand freeze halfway to the button. The system screen dimmed slightly as the storm interfered with the generator lines, and for a moment the entire watch post felt like it was sinking under the weight of the unknown. I tried to gather myself, repeating silently that sunrise wasn't far off, that I just needed to outlast whatever was happening. But then the watch post door handle moved, slowly, silently, as if someone on the other side were testing it. I remember the first time I truly understood Rule 3. Never acknowledge anyone who knocks, whispers, or calls your name during the night shift, and it was far worse than any storm, any creak of metal, or the empty echoing halls of the rig. That night, the wind outside was relentless, battering the rig with a rhythm that made every metal plate vibrate under my feet. I was still reeling from the strange occurrences in the corridor, and the voice over the radio when I heard it. A soft, deliberate whisper behind my left ear, carrying my name in a tone that sounded eerily familiar. My stomach twisted with panic, but instinctively I stayed still, forcing myself to breathe slowly and not turn around, recalling the warning drilled into me since my first night. Acknowledge nothing, respond to no one. The whisper came again, closer this time, threading through the humming of the generators and the rain hammering the metal outside. It wasn't just a voice, it was a presence, as if something or someone was standing right there, just beyond the reach of my vision. I could feel it pressing into the air around me, curling along the edges of the room, testing the boundaries I was meant to maintain. My hand tightened around the flashlight, but I dared not turn it on. Flashing a light, I knew, would signal attention, would confirm to the thing that I had noticed it. I stayed motionless, heart hammering, repeating silently in my head that I would not answer. I would not respond. I would survive. The whispers changed slightly, adopting tones that mimicked voices I knew. You left the corridor open, it hissed. You didn't follow the rule. My chest tightened as dread settled in deeper, each syllable dripping with familiarity and malice. It used the cadence of one of the senior engineers, a man who had trained me during the day, but the words were off, hollow, stretched, almost inhuman. The rig groaned under the wind, masking any sound the thing might have made moving closer, and I realized with a sinking feeling that if I had reacted, if I had answered even once, I would have drawn it nearer. The rule was a lifeline, and I had never understood its gravity until this precise frozen moment. I gripped the edge of the console, knuckles white, and stared at the monitors for reassurance. The corridor feed showed nothing. Again, just a hallway bathed in the sterile glow of the security lights. There was no one there, yet the whispers continued, curling around the room like smoke. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself it could be fatigue or wind shifting through vents. But the intelligence behind the voice denied that comfort. This was deliberate. It was testing me, waiting to see if my human reflexes, curiosity, fear, instinct, would betray me. I swallowed hard and reminded myself, no acknowledgement, do nothing. Survive. Minutes stretched into a silence so oppressive that it was almost a sound itself. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. And with every pulse, the whispers returned, slightly more impatient, almost frustrated. You think you can ignore me, the voice breathed, carrying a texture that made it sound like it came from inside the room, behind my eyes rather than the door. I clenched my teeth and closed my eyes for a split second, willing the sound to stop, willing it to lose interest. When I opened them again, the monitors were normal, the corridor still empty, and the door firmly locked, a reminder that I had, so far, survived by following the rules exactly. I wanted to reach for the emergency beacon, to call for backup, but something in the air made my hands freeze mid-motion. The room temperature felt wrong, as if the breath of something large brushed past the back of my neck. I whispered to myself, do not respond, do not look, do not break Rule 3. The whisper came again, almost coaxing, a soft imitation of my own voice. It's just me. I'm here to help you. Just open up. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to respond, to scream back, but I held tight to the rule. I could feel its presence moving, sliding through corners, crawling along the edges of the floor, as if it were studying the pattern of my compliance. Then came a sudden movement outside the window, a flicker of shadow crossing the platform deck illuminated by the storm lights. My heart slammed against my ribs. I froze, remembering that acknowledging it in any way could be deadly. The shadow moved erratically, as though it knew exactly where I was looking without needing my eyes. I pressed my back to the chair, head low, telling myself over and over that responding was the fastest way to draw it closer. For a long, suffocating minute, it hovered at the edge of perception, testing, waiting, confirming that I had not broken the rule. I had to breathe, had to steady my mind, yet every exhale felt like it would betray me. I counted in my head, slowly, methodically, to distract myself from the soft, sibilant whisper that kept returning to my ears. You will answer, you will open the door, you know you want to, it crooned, playing with the edges of my reason. The rig groaned, metal plates shifting, and the monitors flickered for the first time in hours. Even though nothing showed on the cameras, the presence of the thing was undeniable, pressing against the limits of my nerves. Every instinct screamed that the second I acknowledged it, even silently, it would know, and I would regret it. Minutes dragged into an hour. The storm outside reached a crescendo, shaking the rig violently, but inside, the only sound was that persistent, maddening voice. I clenched my fists, pressed my palms to my eyes, and whispered silently, I will not answer. I will not break Rule 3. The shadows seemed to twist with every heartbeat, morphing into forms that weren't there before, shapes that mirrored my fears. Then abruptly, the voice stopped. Silence reclaimed the room with a weight heavier than before, as if it were waiting, biding its time for the next chance I might falter. My hands trembled, and I realized the sun was still hours away. Survival, I knew, demanded absolute patience. I sank back into the chair, trying to ground myself in the monotony of monitoring the rig systems. Nothing in the feeds moved, no shadows, no whispers, no figures, and yet the lingering sense of being studied refused to dissipate, curling around me like smoke I couldn't escape. My thoughts kept circling back to the rule, the impossibility of ignoring something so calculated and intelligent. I reminded myself, one last time, that Rule 3 was more than a guideline, it was a lifeline. To bend it, even slightly, would invite consequences I didn't yet fully understand, though I was beginning to fear I would find out. I had barely survived the previous whispers when I realized the truth behind Rule 4. Never leave the watch post to investigate strange noises, no matter how close or personal they feel, and it was a lesson I learned the hard way. That night, after the storm seemed to settle just enough for me to catch my breath, I heard it again, a dragging sound along the outer deck, slow and deliberate, like metal scraping against metal. My heart thumped painfully as I rose from my chair, flashlight in hand, every instinct screaming to check it. The rule hammered in my mind, but the part of me that was human, curious, and terrified of being powerless, wanted desperately to know what was out there. The dragging continued, rising in irregular patterns across the steel floor, almost like a rhythm, testing whether I would follow it. I imagined the shape that might be causing it, tall and hunched, gliding across the deck just beyond my vision. Each moment I hesitated, the sound seemed to creep closer, and my skin crawled as if the metal beneath my boots were alive. I reminded myself again that Rule 4 existed for a reason. Those who left the watch post rarely returned, and I wanted to survive. Yet the urge to move, to see what made the noise, was almost unbearable. My muscles twitched, but I gritted my teeth and stayed rooted in place, heart hammering against my ribs. Then I heard it again, unmistakably distinct this time, a metallic tap on the side of the railing, measured and slow. It felt personal, directed at me, an invitation to step outside into the unknown. I clenched the flashlight tighter, feeling the vibrations from the impact travel up my arm. The rules echoed in my mind: no movement, no engagement, survive. My breath came in shallow bursts, sweat forming along my hairline, but I refused to step past the safety of the watch post. The noise continued, almost mocking me, testing my patience and resolve, as if aware of how fragile human self-control can be. Minutes stretched painfully as I tried to convince myself it was nothing: wind, storm debris, a stray piece of equipment, but deep down I knew better. The rig's noises are familiar to anyone who spends nights here. This was different. It had intent, a deliberate pattern that no ordinary storm could replicate. I felt a strange coldness settle around me, like the temperature had dropped only inside the watch post. My mind raced with scenarios, all terrifying, all reinforcing the importance of Rule 4. The longer I stayed, the more the fear sank into my bones, and I began to understand why previous watchmen emphasized it with such urgency. My hand hovered near the console, torn between calling for backup and staying isolated. The monitors remained unnervingly normal, showing nothing along the corridor or deck. Yet the sound persisted, scraping and dragging closer to the outer edge of the rig. I could almost feel its presence through the thin steel walls, shifting, adjusting, moving with patience and precision. I resisted the primal instinct to lean out, to see who or what was causing the noise, knowing that doing so would break the rule and possibly seal my fate. Suddenly, the dragging stopped, leaving a void of silence more oppressive than the storm had been. I dared to glance toward the door, toward the steel threshold that marked the boundary of safety, and a shiver ran through me. Somewhere in the darkness outside, the presence lingered, aware of me, observing, testing my restraint. My mind screamed to run, to investigate, to do something, but the lesson of Rule 4 burned in my head. Stepping out, even 1 inch beyond the threshold, was an invitation I could not afford. I sank back into the chair, gripping the edges of the armrests, silently counting the minutes until sunrise. I thought about the others who had held this post before me. Their warnings, half believed, now made sense. The rig is an isolated world, a metal skeleton floating above the deep ocean, and at night it reveals its true nature to those foolish enough to leave their posts. The intelligence behind the noises, the slow, deliberate disturbances, was patient, calculating, and it had no reason to act unless provoked. My eyes darted back to the corridor monitors, every shadow twisting into something sinister, but I remained seated, mind racing with the memory of whispered threats and my own nearly fatal curiosity. Hours passed in agonizing tension. Every small creak of the rig, every groan of metal under wind and rain, was magnified in my mind. I forced myself to stay calm, to focus on routine checks and the steady hum of the generator, all while knowing that a single lapse could invite disaster. I replayed the rule over and over. Rule 4: do not leave the watch post. Do not investigate. Survival depended on restraint. And yet, deep in my chest, I knew that when morning finally came, the echoes of that night would linger, a constant reminder of how easily human instinct can betray us. The first pale light of dawn crept over the horizon, touching the edges of the rig, and I allowed myself a slow, trembling exhale. The dragging noises had ceased entirely, leaving only the natural creaks and hums of the oil rig. For the first time that night, I dared to glance toward the door, imagining what might have been lingering just outside, waiting for a moment of weakness. The reality of Rule 4, that even the slightest curiosity could be deadly, settled into me like a cold, permanent weight. I knew the next shift would test me again, and that I had barely survived the night. The first time I truly understood Rule 5, never touch or move any object that isn't part of your assigned equipment. No matter how insignificant it seems, I was still shaking from the previous night's events. The rig felt alive in a way that words can't capture. Each metal plate, vent, and cable humming with an unseen tension. I was doing my routine rounds near the generator wing when I noticed something small lying on the floor, an unmarked wrench, slightly rusted, just sitting there as if someone had left it for me to find. My fingers itched to pick it up, curiosity burning like fire, but every instinct screamed to leave it alone, the rule echoing in my mind like a lifeline. I stared at the wrench for what felt like minutes, reasoning that it might have been left by a maintenance crew member earlier that day. Probably nothing, I muttered to myself. But even as I said it, the air felt heavier, charged with a strange tension that made my skin prickle. I remembered the whispered warnings from older watchmen about tools, objects, anything not assigned. Moving them always brings attention, and attention on a night shift can be deadly. I tried to tell myself it was paranoia, a reaction from sleepless nights and stormy weather, but the sense of being watched pressed against my mind relentlessly. The generator monitors flickered briefly, as if reacting to my thoughts, and I flinched. The wrench lay there innocuously, but the shadows around it seemed to shift subtly, bending toward it in ways that defied reason. I reminded myself again of Rule 5, speaking it quietly to ground myself. Do not touch anything. My pulse raced as a soft, almost imperceptible hum rose from the floor, vibrating faintly beneath my boots. It wasn't part of the generator's normal rhythm, and it grew as my eyes lingered on the wrench, almost like it was calling to me, coaxing me to pick it up. I clenched my fists to resist, the very air seeming to conspire against my restraint. Minutes passed in tense stillness. Every small movement in the rig, the groan of metal, the click of a distant valve, the wind howling outside, felt amplified, magnified into a chorus of warning. I watched the wrench as if it might leap or move on its own, though I knew that was impossible. Rationality was useless in the face of the rig's nighttime behavior. I kept my hands behind my back, leaning against the wall, willing myself to stay calm and follow the rule. Every instinct screamed to act, to interact, but the whisper of Rule 5 in my mind reminded me survival demanded restraint. Then it happened, a faint shift in the shadows around the wrench, almost like a ripple moving through air too dense to breathe. I felt my body tense, every nerve screaming. The sound of metal scraping softly along the floor reached my ears, deliberate and measured, as if someone or something was testing me. I knew that the slightest contact with the object would make me a target, that the rig had rules beyond human comprehension, and that the consequences were immediate and severe. My heartbeat thundered in my chest as I focused all my energy on standing still, refusing to let curiosity get the better of me. Hours dragged, each one heavier than the last. The storm outside raged intermittently, the rig creaking and swaying under the violent wind. I watched the wrench the entire time, silent and motionless, resisting the pull to pick it up. It was tempting in a way that made my skin crawl, the idea that something so small could hold such significance in a place governed by rules I barely understood. I told myself over and over that Rule 5 existed for a reason, and breaking it could unleash consequences far beyond what I could imagine. The lesson was burned into me as my eyes refused to leave the object, a silent warning etched into the night. At some point, the dragging noises from earlier returned, slower now, almost cautious, but still present, sliding across the deck outside, as if testing the boundaries of the watch post. I felt the vibrations through the floor and shivered, glancing at the monitors that showed only the static halls and the empty corridors. The wrench remained exactly where it had been, but in that moment, it seemed imbued with a kind of silent power, a presence that the rig itself seemed to acknowledge. I clenched my fists and pressed my palms to my eyes, feeling the oppressive weight of being watched and tested simultaneously. Following the rule wasn't just about restraint. It was about staying alive in a place that didn't forgive mistakes. Time moved slowly, agonizingly, until the first streaks of dawn crept over the horizon. The wrench remained untouched, silent, and harmless in the weak morning light, but I knew better. The rig had tolerated my compliance for the night, and the warning had been clear. Objects not assigned to me were not mine to interact with, and any deviation from that boundary could be fatal. I slumped into my chair, exhausted and trembling, yet oddly grateful to still be alive. The memory of the night, and the silent power of that wrench, would haunt me forever, a testament to the importance of Rule 5 and the invisible forces that governed life on the rig. I had barely recovered from the night with the wrench when I learned Rule 6. Never enter the lower maintenance decks alone, even for routine checks, after 1 a.m., and it immediately made me question everything I thought I understood about the rig. That night, the storm had quieted just enough to make the deck floors slick with rain, reflecting the dim emergency lights in eerie, warped patterns. My assignment called for a routine inspection of the lower decks, a task I'd done dozens of times in daylight without issue. But now, in the oppressive darkness, with the memory of whispered voices and dragging shadows fresh in my mind, I felt the full weight of the rule pressing on me like a physical force. As I descended the narrow metal staircase, each step groaned under my boots, echoing down the shafts into the unseen depths below. The walls closed in as I reached the first landing, a long, cramped corridor stretching into darkness, punctuated only by the weak glow of flickering lights. I forced myself to focus on my checklist: valves, pipes, and emergency systems. Every instinct screamed at me to return upstairs, to remain in the safety of the watch post where rules like Rule 6 were easier to follow. Still, the thought that a senior officer might see me avoiding my duties added a tension that clawed at my conscience. Halfway through the corridor, the lights above me flickered violently, casting sharp, shifting shadows that danced across the walls and floors. I heard it then, a soft scraping, deliberate, like metal being pushed across the deck above. The sound wasn't mechanical. It carried an intelligence, a patient, calculating awareness. I froze, knowing that the rule was there for a reason, that leaving the safety of my station alone after 1 a.m. was far more dangerous than I had imagined. My pulse thundered in my chest as I considered turning back, but the routine demanded I continue, and fear alone wasn't enough to justify breaking protocol entirely. I moved cautiously, keeping my flashlight trained on the nearest panels and equipment, trying to convince myself that I was imagining the noises. Every shadow looked like a figure standing just beyond the edge of the light, waiting, patient. I reminded myself of Rule 6, repeating it in my mind like a mantra: do not go alone, do not underestimate the danger. The corridor walls seemed to stretch further than normal, the metal floors creaking beneath the weight of something unseen. I could feel a presence moving alongside me, just outside the beam of my flashlight, invisible but undeniable. As I reached the junction near the central pump room, the air shifted, becoming colder and heavier, pressing against me like water in a deep trench. The ventilation hum changed pitch, warping in ways that felt almost deliberate. I stopped, listening, and the silence that followed was louder than any noise I had heard before. It was as though the rig itself was waiting for me to make a choice, to test my compliance with Rule 6. I could feel my breath coming faster, shallow and tense, as I debated whether to retreat or continue. The faint sound of dragging returned, subtle and slow, as if whatever had been moving in the shadows above had decided to descend, following me into the lower decks. I reminded myself again, silently, that no routine task was worth stepping into danger alone. The metal walls seemed to pulse with each step I took, vibrating faintly beneath my boots. I could almost feel the weight of the unseen entity pressing down, testing my adherence to the rule. My flashlight flickered, the beam slicing through the darkness in jittering bursts, and the shadows at the edges of my vision seemed to shift and stretch unnaturally. Each flicker made me flinch, imagining figures crouching in the corners, watching, learning my rhythm, aware of my compliance or hesitation. Halfway through the pump room, a faint whisper carried across the walls, barely audible, repeating fragments of my name. My stomach twisted in fear, and I felt the sweat on my brow cold against the steel of my collar. I forced myself to stay calm, repeating the rule over and over in my mind. Rule 6, do not enter alone. The whisper didn't come from a person I could see. It carried from somewhere above, below, everywhere at once. The rig seemed to breathe with me, the metallic surfaces expanding and contracting with a life I had not noticed before. My hands shook slightly as I noted a small tool knocked off a panel, rolling just out of reach. Another test of restraint, a reminder of previous warnings. The low hum of machinery grew distorted, echoing unnaturally through the narrow corridors of the deck. Shadows bent in impossible ways, creating angles and shapes that no ordinary light could produce. The more I focused on the task, the more aware I became of something moving just beyond perception, brushing against the periphery of my senses. I tried to steady myself by focusing on the checklist, running through valves and panels methodically, counting steps to maintain control. Yet the tension gnawed at me, a persistent warning that the rig was far more dangerous at night than it seemed, and that Rule 6 was one of the few shields I had against the unknown. As the first hints of dawn began to filter through the upper vents, the oppressive pressure in the lower decks lifted slightly, though I still felt eyes innumerable, patient, unseen, following me. The dragging noises ceased, leaving only the normal hum of machinery. I exhaled slowly, leaning against a panel, grateful to have survived the night without yielding to the compulsion to explore or investigate. The lesson was painfully clear. The lower decks at night were not meant for a lone watchman. Rule 6 existed because the rig itself had rules, forces beyond understanding that would punish curiosity, impatience, or disobedience with merciless precision. I finally climbed back to the upper deck, knees weak, heartbeat hammering, knowing that breaking this rule, even slightly, could have been my last mistake. The first rays of sunlight reflected off the steel surfaces, but the memory of the whispers, the shadows, and the oppressive presence lingered. I understood now that survival depended not on bravery or curiosity, but on strict obedience, and even then, the rig tested every margin of human patience. I learned the meaning of Rule 7. If you see your own silhouette moving anywhere it shouldn't be, do not acknowledge it. On a night when the fog rolled in so thick, it felt like stepping into wet cotton. The deck lights were dimmed by the mist, turning every shadow into a shifting blur, and the air tasted metallic, like the rig itself was exhaling something old and heavy. I was returning from the generator readouts when I noticed a shape ahead of me, familiar, too familiar. It was my silhouette, same height, same posture, standing perfectly still at the far end of the corridor, even though I was alone, and the lights behind me weren't bright enough to cast anything that far. For a moment, I told myself it had to be a trick, a reflection, a shadow cast by the emergency panels, anything but what the rule warned about. But the silhouette didn't behave like a shadow. It stood too solid, too defined, and it faced me directly, despite the light source being behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I remembered Rule 7. the warning that acknowledging it in any way could trigger something. The older watchman refused to explain. I tried to keep walking, eyes forward, heart pounding, as if the rig itself were trying to shove blood through my body too fast. The shape didn't move, but I could feel its attention cling to me like a second skin. Halfway down the corridor, I felt the temperature drop sharply, the air behind me growing colder than the fog outside. The silhouette remained at the far end, perfectly still, but the shadows on the walls around me shifted unnaturally, bending toward it like gravity pulling in the wrong direction. I forced myself to look away, to focus on the lines of rust along the metal floor and the dull hum of the lights overhead. Every part of me screamed to glance back, to see if it had moved closer, but I repeated the rule silently until the words blurred into my breath. The corridor seemed to stretch with each step, turning the distance into something unreal and disorienting. Near the junction, the overhead light flickered, and for a fraction of a second the corridor went black. When it returned, the silhouette was gone, but the cold hadn't lifted. I didn't slow down. I didn't let my mind process what that meant. The rig creaked subtly, the metal vibrating with a strange resonance, as if responding to the presence that had disappeared from sight. I kept my focus forward, shoulders stiff, fighting the urge to run, knowing that sudden panic was exactly what the rule cautioned against. A faint murmur echoed behind me, not a whisper, not a voice, but something softer, like breath brushing against the back of my neck. I forced myself to maintain a steady pace, feeling the weight of unseen eyes tracking my steps. The deeper I moved into the corridor, the more distorted the shadows became, stretching against the walls at impossible angles. My own real shadow, faintly cast by the emergency lights, trembled with every flicker, but I didn't dare look for the imitation again. The oppressive silence pressed against my eardrums, amplifying the sound of my breathing until it felt too loud, too vulnerable. I knew that breaking Rule 7 by reacting would invite the thing wearing my shape to close the distance, and I wasn't ready to learn what happened next. As I approached the stairwell, the air shifted once more, the icy pressure lifting just enough to breathe normally again. I fought the urge to turn around, even for reassurance, knowing the rule demanded absolute discipline. The rig groaned overhead, a long, heavy stretch of steel that echoed through the deck like a warning. My hand trembled as I reached for the railing, gripping the cold metal to steady myself. The corridor behind me felt deeper, darker, as though something had moved into the space I had just left, occupying it with silent intent. I climbed the stairs, keeping my eyes locked on the steps, refusing to let curiosity drag my gaze anywhere else. The feeling of being watched ebbed slowly, replaced with a dull ache behind my eyes that pulsed with each heartbeat. When I reached the upper floor, I exhaled shakily, the tension in my chest finally loosening. The fog outside had thinned, allowing the faint glow of distant lights to seep through the windows, but even with the improved visibility, I couldn't shake the certainty that something down below was still standing in the corridor, still facing the direction I had gone, still waiting for me to make a mistake. By the time I reached the watch post, the chill had left my fingers, but the memory of the silhouette lingered like oil clinging to skin. I understood the importance of Rule 7 in a way no explanation could have prepared me for. The rig didn't just echo your movements at night. Sometimes it mimicked you, tested your reactions, waited for acknowledgement, and even though I survived the encounter, the presence that wore my shape had moved with deliberate purpose, as if learning, understanding, preparing for the next opportunity. I learned the danger of Rule 8. Never look directly at the reflection in the observation windows. After 0300 hours, during a night that began like any other, but ended with my sanity teetering on a knife's edge, the observation windows lined the outer walls of the upper deck, offering a view of the black water stretching into the Mariana Trench below. Yet after midnight, these windows became something else entirely. What was supposed to be a reflection of the lab, the machines and me turned into a warped, unpredictable mimicry of reality. That first night, I caught a movement in the glass that made me freeze mid-step. It wasn't my reflection, not exactly, but something that bore my shape, my posture, and the faintest glint of my eyes. At first I thought fatigue, or the storm outside was to blame. The lights flickered violently, shadows bent at impossible angles, and the waves outside sloshed against the hull in irregular patterns. I squinted into the glass, trying to convince myself that the figure standing behind my own reflection was a trick of light, yet every instinct screamed that it wasn't. The longer I stared, the more my reflection seemed to twist independently, subtly, almost mockingly. I remembered the old warning from the senior watchman, whispered during my first week. The glass doesn't just reflect you. After 0300 hours, it shows what you don't want to see. I should have walked away immediately, but curiosity has a way of chaining you to danger. The first real terror struck when I moved my hand, and the reflection's hand didn't move in sync. It lingered slightly above mine, hovering, its fingers twitching in ways my own could not replicate. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to blink, to look elsewhere, but my eyes kept returning to the window, as if drawn by some magnetic insistence. The reflection's face seemed subtly distorted, thinner and paler, eyes glinting with an intelligence that wasn't mine. I wanted to shout, to step back, to call for help, but I remembered Rule 8 and forced myself to breathe shallowly, avoiding any motion that would give acknowledgement. Time became a warped, fluid thing as the reflection continued its quiet mimicry. I could feel it watching, studying me, waiting for the moment I broke the rule. My pulse thumped in my ears, and I clutched the metal railing near the window for support, trying to convince myself that it was just a shadow, a trick of light, or the reflection of the faint emergency lights bouncing off the water outside. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever inhabited the glass at this hour was not subject to human understanding. It existed to test compliance, to punish hesitation, to exact a toll from anyone foolish enough to look too long. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I had no way of telling. The reflection grew more animated, mimicking gestures I hadn't made, tilting its head, squinting slightly, smirking faintly, movements I had not performed in reality. The unnatural smoothness of its motions made my skin crawl. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, trying to steady myself, heart hammering in my chest. Any reaction, any acknowledgement of its existence, could have meant the end. The memory of previous rules, of flooded corridors and floating objects, surged in my mind. Each lesson reinforced the necessity of obedience. Then, without warning, the reflection's eyes widened, focusing sharply on me, and I felt as though something had reached out from inside the glass, brushing against the space between my body and the window. My entire body froze. Even the metal floor beneath my feet seemed to tremble slightly under this unseen pressure. I did not breathe audibly. I did not shift my gaze. The only sound was the faint hum of the ventilation system, now warping in pitch as if resonating with the glass itself. The reflection smiled, but it wasn't a human smile. It was an intent, predatory, knowing. I forced myself to take one slow step back. The reflection mirrored the movement, but in reverse, as if testing whether I would break the rule entirely. My limbs shook, my teeth chattered, but I refused to acknowledge it. I whispered the rule to myself over and over, a fragile shield against the force that pressed through the glass. The air felt thicker, heavier, charged with something I could neither see nor touch, yet could feel in the marrow of my bones. Every instinct screamed to flee, but the very act of turning my back risked drawing it closer. The lights flickered again, longer this time, leaving the observation windows in a dim, uneven glow. For the first time I noticed subtle distortions in the lab behind me, faint shadows stretching unnaturally, as if the reflection inside the window was beginning to extend its influence outward. I tightened my grip on the railing, suppressing the instinct to flee. My chest burned as I held my breath, counting seconds like years waiting for the danger to abate. The reflection didn't move closer physically, but the feeling of presence grew, pressing into me, tugging at my mind. bending reality just enough to make me question everything I had ever trusted about this rig. Hours passed, or at least it felt that way. Eventually, the first hints of dawn began to penetrate the thick darkness beyond the rig's portholes, and with the faint light, the reflection's movement slowed, its unnatural coordination faltering slightly. The shadows in the lab seemed to return to their proper angles, the glass once again merely reflecting what it should. I exhaled shakily, knees weak, and stepped back fully, unable to shake the feeling that the window had been alive, watching me, feeding off my fear. That night, I understood the full purpose of Rule 8. It wasn't a guideline for sanity, but a boundary, a barrier between life and whatever resides in the unlit ocean outside. Even now I avoid the windows after 0300 hours. I keep my distance, keep my head down, and repeat the rule like a prayer. The reflection waits, it always waits, and I know that the moment I slip, the moment curiosity outweighs discipline, it will reach through the glass again. The rig itself seems complicit, humming with an awareness that mirrors the thing in the window, a silent enforcer of the rules, a reminder that some reflections aren't yours to see. The flooding had started slowly, almost imperceptibly, creeping up through the lower decks after the drainage pumps failed. By the time I realized how high the water had risen, it was already past my knees, and the usual echo of my boots was drowned in the gurgling of the currents. The emergency lights flickered weakly, throwing distorted reflections across the water's surface, and the observation windows that had haunted me earlier seemed dark, ominous, as if the ocean itself had begun pressing into the lab. Every sound felt magnified, reverberating across the metal decks. And that's when I first heard it, the slow, deliberate breathing that no machine could produce. At first I thought it was my own imagination, a leftover effect from Rule 8 and the reflection that refused to stay behind the glass. But the next inhale was wet and deliberate, sliding through the flooded corridor with a rhythm that mocked my own heartbeat. I froze mid-step, lungs tightening as adrenaline surged. The water around my legs seemed to grow heavier, as if whatever was behind that sound pressed down on the liquid itself, trying to mark its territory. I remembered the warning drilled into me on my first night. Rule 9. If you hear breathing in the flooded corridors, hold your own until it stops. I swallowed hard, clamped my mouth shut, and waited, even as panic clawed at the edges of my mind. Each exhale seemed to circle me, traveling with a precision that defied logic. The temperature of the water dropped sharply, freezing my fingers and toes, but I dared not move. My eyes scanned the dim outlines of pipes, cables, and submerged railings, but nothing emerged. There was only sound, each breath a tangible presence pressing against my body from every direction at once. I fought the urge to gasp, to move, to seek the source, knowing that any action could betray my position. This was the rule in action. Patience, silence, endurance, survival demanded it. Minutes or maybe hours. Past time had become distorted underwater, warped by fear and darkness. The exhalation slowed, and I could feel the rhythm of the creature or entity syncing with the pulsing hum of the emergency lights above. It wasn't merely an animal. The sound carried intelligence, awareness, deliberate testing of my discipline. Every muscle in my body screamed to flee, yet I could feel the water around my legs shifting in tiny currents, subtle but intentional. The fear that had wrapped around me, like steel, reinforced the truth of Rule 9. Do not react. Do not fight the presence. Do not breathe except on your terms. Then came the moment I almost failed. A cold pressure brushed my calf, soft, fleeting, like fur or wet cloth sliding along skin. My spine froze as instinct screamed to leap, to pull away, to surface immediately. But I held my ground, fingers gripping the metal railing of the nearby console to anchor myself, remembering every warning ever whispered about the flooded decks. Hold your own, the mantra repeated in my mind. Do not give it the satisfaction of seeing you break. The water around me rippled again, this time subtly guiding itself against my legs, as if to say it had noticed my hesitation. I swallowed down the panic, forcing my diaphragm to stay still, lungs taut and silent. The exhale returned, this time slower, deliberate, measured. It came from behind a submerged panel, then from beneath a staircase I hadn't dared enter, then near the flooded hatch leading to the lower engine room. The entity, or whatever it was moving fluidly through the water, but never fast, never in a way that forced me to react. Its patience was suffocating, pressing into my chest, making the weight of the water seem heavier than the ocean itself. I had to remind myself repeatedly, movement is danger, breath is danger, attention is danger. To survive, I had to pretend the world was still, even as it threatened to pull me under. I began to measure my breaths even more carefully, tiny inhalations taken only when the surface of my mouth was above water, and exhalations so quiet that even the metal grates couldn't carry the sound. My focus narrowed, and I could feel every vibration in the water, every minuscule ripple, as though the entity's presence was a separate gravity. Something brushed past my shoulder, a slight displacement in the water's reflection, but when I looked, nothing was there. The lights above flickered, creating the illusion of movement in the panels. Yet again, I reminded myself, acknowledge nothing. The rule existed because reaction is the fastest way to die down here. I counted my steps carefully, dragging my legs through the knee-high flood with the precision of a diver threading a minefield. Each step could have been my last, and yet, by focusing only on the floor beneath me and the checklist in my mind, I forced myself to maintain some semblance of routine. The whispers of previous watchmen echoed, vague but insistent, warning that the breathing in these corridors was not the work of natural creatures. Something ancient, patient, and intelligent inhabited the water, and it would exploit any lapse in vigilance. My hands ached from gripping the rail, and my legs trembled with the effort of holding still, but I kept going, because moving too fast, or panicking, was exactly what would betray me. I reached the junction near the submerged storage lockers, the water here rising higher with each passing hour. The breathing circled me, closer now, more confident, testing my will. I could feel it watching me, as if it were aware of every micro-expression of fear on my face, every twitch of my fingers gripping the console. For a terrifying moment, I thought I saw a shadow just beneath the surface mimic my posture, moving slightly out of sync with me. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to breathe carefully, maintaining the rule as if my life depended on it, because it did. Rule 9 wasn't just a guideline, it was a boundary between survival and annihilation. Hours dragged, the storm above finally settling into distant rumbles. The water began to calm, though the cold lingered, wrapping around me like a second skin. The breathing slowed, became intermittent, and eventually stopped entirely. When I finally dared to move, the water seemed almost lighter, the oppressive pressure of the unseen presence lifting with its departure. My legs were stiff, my lungs burned, but I had survived by obeying the rule, by maintaining patience and discipline in the face of a terror that had no physical form. The flooded corridors were still and silent now, yet I knew the lesson of Rule 9 would haunt me forever. The moment I breathed too loudly, the moment I reacted, could have been my last. By the time I returned to the upper levels, the rig was bathed in the faint gray light of dawn filtering through the portholes. I sank onto my chair, soaked and shivering, exhausted beyond comprehension, but alive. And I understood at last that in this place, survival didn't come from courage or curiosity, it came from absolute obedience. Even when the rules seemed impossible to follow, the breathing might return tonight, or tomorrow, or next week, but I would hold my own. I had learned the hard way that in the flooded corridors, reacting is death, and patience is life. When I returned to the upper decks after surviving the flooded corridors, the shift room felt eerily calm, almost peaceful, as though the rig itself wanted me to drop my guard for the first time all night. My clothes clung to me, cold and heavy, and the air blowing from the vents only made it worse, carrying the scent of rust and salt that clung to every wall. I sank heavily into the nearest chair, just trying to feel solid ground beneath me again. When a faint thud echoed from outside the nearest porthole, it was soft, distant, barely there, but enough to make my chest tighten because I knew what it meant. Rule 10. Never touch anything that floats in from the open sea, no matter how harmless it looks. That rule was drilled into every watchman, but I had never understood why until that moment. I stood slowly, letting the feeling return to my legs as I approached the observation window. Dawn light had finally stretched across the water, painting the waves in pale silver, and for a brief second I thought maybe the night was done testing me. But something interrupted the reflection on the surface, something drifting, turning with the movement of the tide, bumping gently against the rig's outer beams. My first instinct was curiosity, the human weakness the older workers always warned me about, the same weakness that had destroyed the rookies who came before me. The object outside was small, bright, and slow-moving, something that didn't seem threatening at all, but the rules existed for a reason, and part of me already knew that harmless didn't exist out here. I leaned closer, squinting through the warped glass as the object drifted nearer. It looked like a sealed canister, smooth, metallic, and strangely clean. Too clean for something that had spent time in open water. No rust, no algae, no scratches. That alone made my skin crawl. In the ocean, everything ages fast, everything decays, everything carries the scars of its journey. This thing looked pristine, untouched, as if it had been placed in the water minutes ago. I swallowed a rising sense of unease and forced myself to back away because I knew what would come next. These objects never stayed still for long. They watched you, tested you, waited for you to break protocol. The thud returned, louder this time, echoing through the metal frame of the rig. The canister had bumped against the porthole directly, tapping gently like someone trying to catch my attention. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped backwards again, letting my eyes adjust to the faint glow reflecting off the object's surface. It felt deliberately placed, intentionally delivered, as if it knew I was the only one awake. A strange pressure settled in my chest, the same pressure I felt when the breathing circled me in the flooded corridors. Except this time, instead of hiding in shadows or water, the danger was knocking in plain sight, brazen and confident. I turned away, forcing myself toward the equipment locker. I needed to focus on routine, check the monitors, track the storm's path, complete the log entries, anything that kept my mind away from the lure outside the window. But the moment I reached for my radio, it flickered with static, the signal disrupted by something far below us in the water. The static wasn't the usual kind. It pulsed, rising and falling with a slow rhythm, almost like that same unnatural breathing I'd heard earlier. My fingers trembled as I set the radio down, suddenly aware that whatever floated outside wasn't random. It was connected to the presence that stalked the corridors, connected to the reflection that didn't follow my movements, connected to every warning we had been given since arriving on this rig. I walked back to the window because I couldn't help myself. This time, the canister had turned slightly, showing one side I hadn't seen before. A symbol was etched into the metal, faint but unmistakable, a spiral shape, uneven, almost organic in the way it twisted inward. I pressed my hand against the glass instinctively, not to touch it, but to measure how close it had drifted. Only the thickness of the reinforced porthole separated us. A sharp shiver ran through me as I imagined the thing touching the glass with intent rather than by accident. The symbol seemed to pulse faintly, though I couldn't tell if it was the reflection or something moving inside the object itself. I forced myself away from the window again, pacing around the shift room with growing frustration. "Don't touch it," I whispered under my breath, echoing the warnings from every briefing. "Don't even think about it." I tried to distract myself by running system diagnostics, but the panels flickered, screens washed out in pale static that looked almost like swirling water trapped behind the glass. My hands hovered over the keys. Useless. The rig wanted me to focus on the drifting object. Or maybe the object wanted the rig to react. I wasn't sure anymore where the boundaries of influence ended. Minutes passed, then longer, the silence growing sharper than any noise. When I looked back at the window, my stomach twisted violently. The canister was no longer floating freely. It was pressed firmly against the glass, perfectly centered, as if aligning itself to my position. I stepped back, pulse racing, unable to understand how currents alone could move it so precisely. The symbol faced me directly, the spiral pointing inward towards something I suddenly felt was watching. The entire moment felt intentional, like a message I wasn't meant to receive, but was being forced to witness. Then the lights dimmed. Slowly, gradually, each bulb flickered weaker, bathing the room in a cold blue haze. My breath fogged the air even though the vents were still running. I moved toward the far wall, away from the window, from the object, from whatever intelligence pushed it closer. I reached the emergency breakers on instinct, but when I flipped the switch, nothing changed. The power drop wasn't electrical, it was atmospheric, as if something outside had placed pressure on the rig itself, stealing energy from the air. And then I heard it. Not a sound, more like a vibration under my skin, a pulse moving through the steel floor, up my legs, into my spine. It resonated with something deep inside me, pulling at a feeling I didn't want to recognize. The canister wasn't just an object, it was an invitation, a test, a trap, something that waited for a moment of weakness, a touch, a grip, a single act of curiosity. My head throbbed with the unspoken demand to open the outer hatch, to bring the object inside, to see what secrets it carried. My fingers twitched involuntarily toward the manual override, and I had to clench them into fists to stop myself. My eyes darted between the hatch controls and the window, a silent war building inside my chest. The canister was still there, still centered, still watching. My reflection in the glass looked strange, pale, uneven, almost misshapen in a way I couldn't explain. I forced myself to steady my breathing, grounding my mind with the memory of the flooded corridors. I had survived because I obeyed. I had endured because I followed the rules. And if I touched that thing, if I even tried to bring it inside, the ocean wouldn't need to drown me. Whatever intelligence hid inside that object would do it for me. Finally, after what felt like hours, the object drifted backward, slowly peeling away from the glass, moving back into the open sea, as if losing interest. The lights brightened, the air warmed, and the vibration in my chest faded. By the time it disappeared into the fog rising off the waves, I collapsed onto the chair behind me, trembling with a mixture of relief and dread. I knew one thing with absolute certainty: that object hadn't chosen me randomly. It had targeted me because the rig had broken me down over the last several nights, and the ocean wanted to finish the job. And I also knew this wasn't the last time something would float in. The sea always returned its messages, and each one was meant for someone who had already been marked. The final rule was the one I had been dreading since my first night on the rig, yet I never understood its true weight until the storms had passed, and the waves had calmed into a deceptive lull. The upper decks glistened under a moonlight that made the steel look almost liquid, reflecting shadows that seemed to move on their own. I had survived 8 previous rules, each one testing my restraint, patience, and sanity. But Rule 11, never leave the rig alone at night, no matter how safe or empty it seems, was different. It was absolute. It didn't matter if the hallways were empty, if the machines hummed quietly, or if the observation windows reflected only my own exhausted face. The rig's danger wasn't always visible, and the moment I stepped outside the confines of its safe corridors, I risked everything. That night, I felt compelled to check the storage bay near the edge of the platform. The supply logs had errors I couldn't explain, items missing that should have been there. And while my rational mind argued it was human error, a lingering unease urged me to verify it personally. The air outside was thick with salt and a biting wind that tugged at my jacket, and even as I gripped the handrails, I reminded myself of Rule 11, repeating it silently like a lifeline. I moved slowly, each step measured, my eyes scanning for anomalies in the dim deck lights. Everything seemed calm, almost too calm, as if the night itself were holding its breath, waiting for me to make the smallest mistake. Halfway to the storage bay, the rig groaned under its own weight, metal bending and shifting with an intensity that made my stomach lurch. The moonlight revealed strange movements in the shadows near the edges of the platform, shapes that should not have existed. My heart pounded, and I forced my legs to keep moving, knowing that turning back now would be as dangerous as continuing forward. Every previous rule whispered warnings in my mind: the flooded corridors, the breathing, the reflections, the drifting objects, all tests that built to this moment. Rule 11 was the final line of defense, the boundary between survival and the unknown that prowled just beyond the deck lights. I reached the storage bay doors, hands slick from the salt spray on the railings. The heavy metal doors were cold beneath my fingers, and as I twisted the handle, I realized something terrifying. The rig was empty. Yes, but it wasn't abandoned. Shadows flickered behind crates. Shapes seemed to stretch and contract with the rhythm of my heartbeat, and the faint metallic scent of something otherworldly lingered in the corners. Every instinct told me to leave immediately, but the rule demanded patience. I reminded myself, do not leave alone, never leave alone. That was the only mantra that kept me from bolting into the darkness, from ignoring the rig's rules entirely. Inside the storage bay was eerily silent, the hum of the rig's systems almost too quiet, as though something had muted it. I walked carefully between the rows of supplies, scanning for inconsistencies, yet the shadows seemed to move with purpose, keeping just out of reach. My flashlight trembled slightly in my hands, but I kept it trained forward, refusing to acknowledge anything that shouldn't be there. I noticed the missing items on the shelves, their absence obvious yet unexplainable. When I reached to record the discrepancy, a faint shift in the shadows caught my attention. The corner of the bay flickered as though something or someone had been following me silently. Panic threatened to overtake reason, but I grounded myself with the final rule. Rule 11 existed because leaving the rig, even into what seemed like empty night, invited things that could not be named, things that the ocean and steel together had birthed to punish curiosity and overconfidence. I reminded myself to breathe slowly, to keep my gaze fixed forward, to move only as necessary. Even in the presence of silence, the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I could feel eyes on the back of my neck, pressures on the air around me, as if the rig itself had become a living guardian of its own secrets, enforcing compliance with a patient, unyielding force. I finished the inspection and began my return along the walkway. The night air had intensified, carrying with it the faint sound of metal dragging across wet surfaces, though I couldn't see anything that could make it. Every step made my muscles ache with tension, but I refused to run, knowing that Rule 11's warning wasn't about speed, it was about presence and awareness. Each shadow along the deck seemed exaggerated, lengthened into shapes that defied logic, yet I didn't acknowledge them, not with a glance, not with a step. My mind repeated the rule like a lifeline: never leave the rig alone at night. The repetition kept me grounded in reality, though the fog and the black water beyond the railings threatened to swallow me whole. By the time I reached the main control room, the moon had hidden behind clouds, leaving the deck illuminated only by emergency lighting. The shadows retreated slightly, the rig returning to a fragile calm. My heart pounded, every nerve still alert for the unseen presences that had been brushing against the edges of my perception all night. I sank into the chair at the console, muscles trembling, exhausted but alive. Rule 11 had proven its purpose. The rig punished anyone who ignored the night's unseen dangers. Surviving it required absolute obedience, vigilance, and the willingness to accept that some threats were beyond human understanding. And as I logged the night's events, I understood something deeper about the rules that governed life on the rig. Each one had prepared me, shaped me, and demanded sacrifice. Rule 11 was not merely a guideline, it was a culmination of every terror I had endured, a test of whether I could survive when confronted with the rig's full unseen force. The wind outside calmed to an uneasy silence, the waves reflecting faint moonlight, but I knew the rig's watch never truly ended. The ocean, the steel, the shadows, they would wait again, patient and relentless, for the next mistake, the next moment of curiosity, the next watchman unprepared for the rules they swore to follow. I slumped in my chair, cold, wet, and trembling, but alive. The weight of 11 rules pressed into me, each one a lesson in fear, obedience, and survival. I could feel the rig breathing around me, alive with an intelligence older than my comprehension, and I knew that even now, far from the flooded corridors, the drifting objects, and the shifting reflections, I was still under its watch. The final rule had taught me what every other rule hinted at. Survival requires compliance, patience, and the humility to respect forces beyond understanding. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.